The Woodcutter Part 1.
The village of Eldermere lay cradled in a lush valley, a place where time moved at the pace of the wind rustling through the trees and the gentle flow of the river that wound its way through the fields. It was a modest settlement, no more than a scattering of thatched roof cottages and cobblestone paths, surrounded on all sides by vast, untamed forests. The trees stood like sentinels, their towering forms whispering ancient secrets to those who dared to listen. Life here was simple, shaped by the rhythms of nature. The rising and setting of the sun, the turning of the seasons, the quiet toil of hands that knew the weight of honest labor. Among the villagers of Eldermere was a young man named Elias, a woodcutter whose life had been shaped by hardship for as long as he could remember. Though he was neither the wealthiest nor the most influential of men, there was a quiet strength in him, an unspoken resilience that had been forged in the crucible of loss. Elias had been orphaned at a tender age, his childhood stolen by the relentless hand of fate. His parents, once the pillars of his small world, had succumbed to illness during one of the cruelest winters the valley had ever seen. The sickness came swiftly, creeping through their modest cottage like a thief in the night, sapping their strength day by day. His father, a man of unwavering endurance, had fought to the very end, refusing to surrender to the fever that burned through him. And his mother, his sweet, gentle mother, had cradled Elias in her arms even as the life drained from her body, whispering reassurances she must have known were untrue. He had been too young to fully understand what was happening, too young to grasp why his father no longer rose with the dawn to chop wood, why his mother's once warm hands grew cold against his cheek. He had sat beside them, waiting for them to wake, unable to comprehend that they never would. In the days that followed, the villagers had taken pity on the orphan boy, offering him scraps of food, a place by their hearths when the nights grew too bitter. But pity was a fleeting thing, and soon Elias learned that the world did not wait for grief to subside. He had no inheritance to claim, no relatives to take him in. Only the empty cottage that now felt far too large for one small boy and a single object of true value, his father's iron axe. From the moment he was strong enough to lift it, that axe had been his lifeline. As a boy, he had learned to swing it with careful precision, splitting logs to keep his hearth warm in the winter and selling firewood to the villagers for a few copper coins. He grew with the trees, his muscles hardened by years of toil, his hands calloused but steady. The work was grueling, demanding more of him than he sometimes thought he had to give. Yet he never faltered. He asked for no pity, sought no shortcuts, only the satisfaction of a day's work done with honor. Every morning, long before the first light of dawn stretched across the valley, Elias would rise and make his way into the forest. He walked the familiar trails with quiet reverence, his breath visible in the crisp morning air, the scent of pine and damp earth filling his lungs. He did not simply chop blindly, as some might. He selected each tree with care, ensuring that the land was never over-harvested, that nature was given the respect it deserved. The villagers took notice. At first, it was in passing. A nod of acknowledgement as Elias carried bundles of freshly chopped wood through the market square, a quiet murmur of approval as he worked tirelessly from dawn until dusk. Rain or shine, summer or winter, he was there, his axe ringing through the trees like a steady heartbeat. While others might have grumbled about their lot in life, Elias never did. He asked for nothing more than what he could earn with his own two hands. Over time, his name became one spoken with quiet respect. Though Elias had little to his name, no vast fields to his claim, no heavy purse weighed down with coins, he possessed something far greater, his word, and in Eldermere, where a man's reputation mattered more than his wealth, that was worth more than gold. If Elias promised a load of firewood, it arrived on time and stacked neatly. If he gave his word on a trade, no man ever found himself cheated. He took only what he needed, never more. And while his life was hard, it was honest. The elders of Eldermere often spoke well of him, their voices tinged with a kind of wistful admiration. "That boy grew up strong," they would say, shaking their heads as they recalled the frail child who had once wandered the village alone. His father would be proud. Even the wealthier merchants and landowners, men who rarely paid mind to those beneath their station, could not deny that Elias was a man of integrity. But though he had the admiration of the village, Elias lived alone. His days were spent in the depths of the forest, where the towering trees stood like ancient sentinels, their canopies weaving patterns of light and shadow across the forest floor. He knew every sound of the woods, the rustling of leaves in the wind, the distant call of a hunting hawk, the scurrying of small creatures in the underbrush. There was peace here, in the quiet solitude of nature, yet it was a solitude that carried an undeniable weight. Elias had learned long ago that there was a difference between being alone and being lonely. He had no family to return to at the end of the day, no warm voice waiting to greet him when he stepped through his door. His modest cottage, though sturdy and well kept, was empty save for the flickering glow of the hearth. The fire crackled, the only sound to break the silence, its warmth reaching outward, but never filling the hollow spaces left by things that might have been. Still, Elias did not dwell on such thoughts. There was work to be done, and work left no room for longings. And so, each day, he rose before the sun, took up his axe, and disappeared into the woods once more. But deep within that ancient forest, beneath the watchful gaze of the towering trees, something waited for him. His fate, woven like the threads of a story yet to unfold, was drawing ever closer. One fateful day, Elias ventured farther than usual in search of strong, dry wood. The recent rains had left much of the lower forest drenched, the soil soft beneath his boots, and the usual groves where he gathered timber were slick with mud. The dampness clung to the trees, the bark slick with moisture, making them difficult to fell and nearly useless for burning. He knew there would be little worth chopping here, not if he wanted to sell good firewood at the market. So he made a decision. He would go deeper. Beyond the well-trodden paths he knew by heart, beyond the groves where the villagers often foraged for mushrooms and wild herbs, lay the riverbank. The trees there stood taller, their trunks thick and ancient, their roots digging deep into the earth as if gripping it with iron fingers. The ground, though damp in places, was more solid, and Elias knew that if he searched carefully, he would find dry, sturdy wood that had not been spoiled by the rains. Yet he hesitated. The river was a treacherous place. Its waters, though deceptively calm on the surface, ran swift and deep. More than one traveler had met their end in its grasp, slipping from the banks and vanishing beneath the foamy torrents, never to be seen again. The villagers spoke of it in hushed tones, warning their children never to wander too close, never to trust the stillness of its waters. Even the most seasoned hunters gave the river a wide berth, for the footing near the edge was uncertain, and the current had a way of pulling even the strongest men under before they could so much as cry out for help. But Elias was not a child, nor was he a man prone to fear. With his axe slung over his shoulder, he adjusted his grip on the leather strap securing it, then pressed forward, stepping off the familiar path and into the unknown. The forest around him thickened as he moved deeper. The towering pines stretching high above, their needled branches forming a canopy that let only slivers of light pierce through. The air was damp with the scent of wet earth and moss, and every step he took was cushioned by the thick layer of fallen leaves that had built up over time. The further he walked, the quieter the world became. The distant chatter of birds faded, replaced by the rhythmic sound of the wind whispering through the trees. Then, at last, he heard it. The low, steady rush of the river. It was an ever-present sound, one that had existed long before him and would continue long after he was gone. The deep voice of nature itself, timeless and unyielding. Elias slowed his pace as he neared the water's edge, his sharp eyes scanning the area. The river was swollen from the recent rains, its surface rippling as it surged between the rocky banks. Sunlight glinted off the water, making it look deceptively inviting, but Elias knew better. He had seen what this river could do. He took a careful step forward, his boots sinking slightly into the softened earth. The trees here were indeed larger, their trunks wide and strong. Some, he noted, had fallen in the storms, their roots jutting into the air like skeletal fingers. They would make excellent firewood if he could get to them safely. But just as he was about to set down his axe and begin his work, something caught his eye. Something unusual, something that did not belong. A flicker of movement beyond the trees. Near the river's edge, Elias stiffened, every muscle in his body going taut as his hand instinctively tightened around the hilt of his axe. He was not alone. The rhythmic thunks of Elias's axe echoed through the forest as he drove the blade into the thick oak before him. Each strike was powerful, deliberate, sending vibrations up his arms. Beads of sweat formed on his brow despite the coolness of the air, and his breath came in steady, controlled exhales. This was his craft, his livelihood, the skill that had sustained him since boyhood. He knew the weight of his axe, like he knew the lines of his own hands, knew the satisfying give of the wood as the blade bit deep. But then, disaster struck. With a sharp crack, the handle of his axe splintered. For the briefest of moments, time seemed to slow. The familiar weight of the tool vanished from his grip as the iron head tore free, spinning wildly through the air like a bird with broken wings. Elias's breath hitched, his eyes widening in horror as he watched it arc toward the river. The dull plunk times of metal meeting water rang out, swallowed almost instantly by the relentless roar of the current. Elias surged forward on instinct, his boots skidding against the damp earth as he lunged toward the riverbank. He caught only the faintest glimpse of the axe's dark silhouette beneath the rushing surface before it was gone, swept away by the merciless pull of the water. Panic flared in his chest. His axe, his father's axe, was gone. He stood frozen, heart pounding in his ears, his breath coming fast and ragged. That axe was more than a tool. It was his lifeline, his means of survival. Without it, he had nothing. No way to chop wood, no way to trade, no way to earn even a single coin. The weight of his entire existence depended on that one object, and now it was lost, stolen away by the river's unyielding grasp. Elias's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Could he go after it? He knew how to swim, but the river was treacherous, swollen from the recent rains, its current strong enough to drag even the most seasoned of swimmers under. He had heard too many stories of men who had been foolish enough to challenge its depths, only to be swallowed whole, their bodies never recovered. His pulse thundered in his ears as he inched closer to the water's edge, peering down into the churning depths. The river was restless, its surface swirling and shifting, disguising the secrets it carried below. His axe was down there, somewhere in the darkness, spinning helplessly, slipping further and further out of reach with every passing second. A raw, aching despair clawed its way into his chest. Slowly, as the full weight of his loss crashed over him, Elias fell to his knees on the damp earth. His fingers dug into the soft mud, his shoulders trembling as he bowed his head. He had spent years building his life from nothing, enduring hardship after hardship without complaint, always pressing forward, but now, for the first time in years, he felt utterly defeated. A hollow ache spread through him, deeper than hunger, heavier than exhaustion. And then, against the howling wind, against the roar of the river, Elias did something he had not done since he was a child. He wept. Elias sat motionless, the weight of his sorrow pressing down on him like a millstone. The river before him roared on, indifferent to his suffering, carrying his only possession of worth deeper into its endless flow. He had always been a man of quiet resilience, enduring hardship without complaint, but this loss struck something deeper. Then, through the rustling leaves and the sighing wind, a voice emerged, soft yet commanding, gentle yet undeniable. It carried no malice, no demand, only the simple weight of curiosity. "My child, why do you weep?" Elias's breath caught in his throat. Slowly, he lifted his gaze, his fingers still clenched in the damp earth. Before him stood an old man unlike any Elias had ever seen. His hair, white as freshly fallen snow, cascaded past his shoulders in soft waves, and his long beard flowed like a river of silver, gleaming even in the dim light beneath the trees. His robes shimmered, not in the way silk catches the sun, but with a glow that seemed to come from within, as if woven from the light of the stars themselves. Yet it was his eyes that held Elias captive, warm and knowing, as deep as an endless sky at dawn. This was no ordinary man. Elias scrambled to his feet, his heart hammering in his chest. He wiped hastily at his tear-streaked face, feeling a strange mix of reverence and awe creeping over him. The stranger tilted his head slightly, his expression neither stern nor pitying, but full of something Elias could not name. With great effort, Elias bowed his head respectfully and spoke. "Sir," he began, his voice hoarse from unshed grief, "I am but a poor woodcutter. My only means of livelihood was the iron axe my parents left me. It has fallen into the river, and now I have nothing." The old man regarded him for a long moment. His gaze held no judgment, only understanding, as though he had heard stories like Elias's 1,000 times before. The rustling of the trees grew softer, as if the very forest had fallen silent to listen. Then, without another word, the old man turned toward the river. Elias watched in stunned silence as the stranger stepped forward, his feet barely making a sound against the damp earth. He raised a single hand and stretched it toward the water. The river, once wild and thrashing, stilled. The churning waves softened into ripples, the once roaring current settling as though it had been tamed by an unseen force. Elias's breath caught as the surface shimmered, as if the sky itself had bent down to touch it. Then, from the depths of the river, something rose. It broke through the water in a slow, deliberate ascent, droplets cascading from its gleaming surface. An axe, one unlike any Elias had ever laid eyes upon. The handle, smooth and perfectly carved, glowed like polished gold, and the blade itself shone as if forged from pure sunlight. It hovered just above the water's surface, suspended in an invisible grasp. The old man turned his wise gaze back to Elias, his voice as calm as the river had now become. Patient. Elias's eyes widened in astonishment, his heart pounding in his chest. The sheer beauty of the axe before him was unlike anything he had ever seen. Far beyond the crude, well-worn iron he had wielded his entire life. He could scarcely imagine the wealth such an axe would bring him, the life it could provide. But deep within him, something stirred. Honesty was all he had. He swallowed hard and shook his head. "No, sir," he said, his voice steady despite his awe. "That is not my axe." A flicker of something unreadable passed through the old man's eyes. Then, without a word, he lowered his hand. The golden axe, gleaming as though it belonged in the hands of kings, sank silently back beneath the river's surface, disappearing into the depths as if it had never existed. The old man raised his hand once more. Again, the water rippled, and, again, another axe emerged. This one, though still finer than anything Elias had ever touched, was different. The handle was silver, engraved with intricate designs that glowed faintly, and the blade was polished steel, sharp as a winter's breath. It hovered above the river, catching the light in a way that made it seem almost alive. The old man turned to Elias once more, his gaze steady. "Is this your axe?" Elias's breath hitched. The axe was magnificent, its craftsmanship unlike anything a simple woodcutter could ever dream of owning. It was finer than any weapon he had ever seen, a tool fit for a nobleman, not a man who spent his days in the solitude of the forest. But again he shook his head. "No, sir," he said, his voice unwavering. "That is not my axe either." A small smile played at the corners of the old man's lips for the third time. He stretched out his hand. The silver axe, just like the golden one before it, sank back into the river's embrace. The water rippled, swirled, then stilled once more. And then, from the depths, a third axe emerged. It was plain humble in every way. The handle was sturdy but worn, smoothed by years of labor. The blade, though strong, bore the marks of age and countless swings against wood. There was no gold, no silver, no shimmering light. But Elias knew it instantly. His heart clenched as he stepped forward. "Yes," he whispered, his voice filled with both relief and reverence. "That is my axe." The old man studied him for a long moment, Then, with a gentle motion of his hand, the axe floated from the water's surface and landed softly at Elias's feet. Elias knelt, his fingers trembling as they closed around the familiar grip. His axe, his father's axe, was returned to him. As he looked up to thank the old man, a strange feeling washed over him, as if the very air around them had shifted. Because the old man was smiling, and Elias had the distinct feeling that something much greater than an axe had been tested in that moment. The old man's lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. His eyes, ancient and wise, gleamed with something Elias couldn't quite name. Approval, perhaps, or a deep understanding that reached far beyond the moment. The very air around them seemed to hum, as if the forest itself recognized the significance of what had just transpired. Elias clutched his humble iron axe tightly, his fingers wrapping around the familiar, well-worn handle. Relief flooded his chest, yet a lingering curiosity burned within him. Who was this man? Why had he summoned such magnificent axes from the depths of the river? The old man took a step forward, his long, shimmering robes shifting like mist in the breeze. His voice, though gentle, carried a weight that made Elias feel as though the trees themselves were listening. "You are an honest man, Elias," the old man said, his tone filled with something deeper than mere praise. "When given the chance to claim wealth beyond your station, you did not falter. You did not reach for what was not rightfully yours. Many would have taken the golden axe and never looked back. But you chose truth over greed." Elias swallowed, unsure of what to say. It had not felt like a test, only a simple truth. How could he have accepted what did not belong to him? The old man lifted his hand, and a soft golden light shimmered around his fingers. "For that, you shall not leave empty-handed." Elias barely had time to react before the air around him shifted. A strange, warm energy crackled through the clearing, stirring the leaves and making the river's surface ripple, as if responding to some unseen force. The light around the old man's hand pulsed brighter, and with a single graceful motion, he swept his arm outward. The river stirred once more. From its depths, the golden axe re-emerged, rising slowly into the air, droplets cascading like molten sunlight from its gleaming surface. Then, beside it, the silver axe followed, its polished steel shining with ethereal brilliance. Both hovered weightlessly, their beauty almost unreal, catching the dappled light filtering through the trees. Elias's breath caught in his throat as the old man turned his palm upward and the axes drifted toward him. "Take them," the old man said, his smile deepening. "A reward for your honesty. Not only will you reclaim what was lost, but you shall leave this place richer than when you arrived." Elias hesitated, staring in disbelief. These were not mere tools, they were treasures. Weapons fit for kings, not a simple woodcutter. The weight of their worth, the fortune they represented, was staggering. With a single stroke of the golden axe, he could cut down trees that would have taken him hours to fell. The silver axe was so finely crafted that it seemed to hum with energy, as if eager to be wielded. But I did nothing to earn these," Elias murmured, shaking his head. "I only told the truth." The old man chuckled, his voice like the rustling of leaves in a summer breeze. "And that, my child, is precisely why you deserve them." Elias hesitated only a moment longer before reaching out. As soon as his fingers brushed the handles of the axes, a strange warmth spread through his hands, as though the very essence of the forest had blessed them. The golden axe was surprisingly light, its balance perfect, the craftsmanship flawless. The silver axe felt sturdy yet swift, an extension of his own strength. And his iron axe, humble, worn, and familiar, remained his truest companion. As he held all three in his grasp, he felt something stir deep within him. This was no ordinary meeting, no ordinary gift. Something in his life was about to change forever. When Elias returned to the village, the sight of him carrying not one, but 3 axes, his humble iron one, along with a gleaming silver and a radiant golden axe, drew the attention of everyone around. Children who had been playing in the dirt stopped mid-game, their eyes widening at the brilliant weapons reflecting the afternoon sun. Merchants at their stalls paused their haggling, craning their necks to get a better look. The village blacksmith, a man who had spent his life forging tools and weapons, narrowed his eyes in disbelief, as if trying to determine whether the weapons were real or some kind of trick of the light. "Elias," called out one of the elders, stepping forward with his staff. "What is this? Where did you come across such treasures?" The crowd pressed in closer, murmuring among themselves, a mix of curiosity and astonishment passing between them. Elias, never one to seek attention, shifted uneasily beneath their gazes. He was no lord, no wealthy merchant, no warrior who had returned from battle with spoils to show. He was a simple woodcutter, a man who had spent his years earning his living one swing of the axe at a time. And yet, here he stood, carrying wealth beyond anything the village had ever seen. Taking a steady breath, he began to recount his tale. He told them of the day's work, of how he had ventured farther than usual in search of strong, dry wood. He described the fateful moment when his axe handle had snapped, the helplessness he had felt as he watched the iron head disappear beneath the rushing waters of the river. The villagers gasped, knowing as well as he did that an axe was not merely a tool, it was a livelihood. Without it, a woodcutter was nothing. And then he spoke of the old man. "A stranger?" a farmer asked, brows furrowed. "Here, in Eldermere's woods?" Elias nodded. "Not just any man, he was unlike any I have ever met. His robes shimmered like mist in the morning sun, and his eyes held wisdom beyond anything I could comprehend." He explained how the old man had tested him, summoning first the golden axe, then the silver one, offering them freely. He spoke of the temptation he had felt, the way his heart had pounded at the sight of such riches. "But I could not take them," Elias admitted. "They were not mine." A silence fell over the villagers. Some exchanged glances, as if questioning whether they too would have made the same choice. Others nodded approvingly, their respect for Elias growing with every word. "And because I was honest," Elias continued, "the old man did not leave me empty-handed. He gave me back my iron axe, as I had hoped, but he also gifted me these." He lifted the golden and silver axes for all to see. Sunlight caught the edges, casting flickering patterns onto the ground. The villagers erupted into astonished whispers. "Truly?" one man asked. "He simply gave them to you?" Elias nodded. "Not as a reward of wealth, but as a lesson, a reminder that honesty is worth more than gold or silver, that a man's integrity is the only true treasure he can ever claim as his own." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, a voice called out from the crowd. "You have always been an honest man, Elias," said the village baker, "and now the whole world shall know it." A cheer rose in agreement, rippling through the villagers like a wave. Children laughed and pointed, their imaginations already spinning grand tales about Elias, the woodcutter blessed by a spirit of the forest. The elders nodded in solemn approval, and even the blacksmith, a man of few words, grunted and gave Elias a firm pat on the shoulder. The story of Elias's virtue spread far beyond Eldermere. Travelers passing through heard of the woodcutter who had chosen honesty over greed and carried axes of silver and gold. Some came from distant villages just to see him, to hear the story from his own lips. His name became known, not for his wealth, but for his character. And though Elias was grateful for the gifts, it was the lesson of the old man that stayed with him the most. Every time he picked up his iron axe to work, he did so with renewed purpose, carrying the wisdom of that fateful day like an invisible treasure within his heart. Years passed, and Elias's life changed in ways he could never have imagined. The days of struggling to make ends meet, of waking before dawn to toil endlessly for just enough coin to survive, were behind him. Yet despite the silver and gold axes in his possession, he never became a man of idle luxury. Instead of selling them, as many might have been tempted to do, Elias put them to use. He quickly realized that these were no ordinary axes. The silver axe, lighter and sharper than any blade he had ever wielded, cut through wood with incredible ease, allowing him to gather more in half the time it once took him. The golden axe, though heavier, never dulled, no matter how many trees it felled. With these miraculous tools in hand, his work became more efficient, his efforts yielding twice, sometimes 3 times, as much wood as before. At the market, He was no longer the struggling woodcutter barely scraping by. The extra firewood he provided fetched higher prices, and merchants sought him out, eager to buy from the man whose name had become known far and wide. With more coin in his pocket, Elias could afford not only to improve his own life, but to give back to the village that had raised him. Yet, even as prosperity found him, Elias never let go of the iron axe, the very same tool his parents had left him, the one that had once been his only means of survival. He kept it close, hanging it above his hearth, a silent guardian watching over him. Whenever he felt the weight of success pressing upon his shoulders, he would take it down, run his fingers over its worn handle, and remember. Remember the struggles, remember the hunger, remember the lesson that had changed everything. Wealth had come to him not because he had sought it, but because he had chosen truth over greed. And so, Elias remained the same at heart, a man of honesty, of hard work, of unwavering integrity. But he did not keep his blessings to himself. With the wealth he earned, he gave freely to those in need. No child in Eldermere would go hungry as he once had. No orphan would know the pain of loneliness without a helping hand. When the winter winds howled through the valley, he made sure every home had enough firewood to last until spring. When a villager fell on hard times, Elias was the first to offer aid, not out of obligation, but out of gratitude for all that had been given to him. And so, as the years went by, the legend of Elias did not fade. He was not just the woodcutter who had received silver and gold from a mysterious old man. He was the man who had proven that honesty was more valuable than any treasure, that wealth was meaningless if not used to help others, and that true prosperity was not measured in coin, but in the kindness one shared. And though his axes shone brightly in the sun, it was the iron one, the simplest, most unremarkable of them all, that remained closest to his heart.
Part 2.
Elias's generosity earned him the admiration of many, but none were as captivated by him as a woman named Lillian. Lillian was beautiful, so much so that people often whispered about her in the marketplace, claiming she looked as though she had stepped out of a storybook. Her golden hair cascaded down her back in waves, catching the sunlight like spun silk, and her eyes, a shade of blue as bright as the morning sky, sparkled with an almost mischievous glimmer. But it was not only her beauty that enchanted those around her, it was the way she carried herself, the effortless charm in her voice, the grace in her every movement. She was the daughter of a merchant who had once been prosperous but had fallen on hard times. Her family, once accustomed to comfort, now struggled to make ends meet, and whispers of their misfortunes had spread through the village. Yet despite their hardships, Lillian never lost her poise. She still walked through the marketplace with her head held high, her smile never faltering, as if she refused to let the weight of her troubles break her spirit. The first time she met Elias, it was by chance. One crisp autumn morning, as Elias was loading freshly chopped firewood onto his cart, Lillian approached him. Dressed in a modest cloak, she stood out among the bustling villagers, her presence commanding attention without even trying. "Good morning, Elias," she greeted, her voice smooth and sweet. Elias turned, surprised to hear his name spoken in such a familiar tone. He had seen her before, of course. Who in the village had not? But they had never exchanged words. He wiped his brow, straightening up. "Good morning," he replied, nodding politely. She glanced at the neatly stacked wood, then back at him with an appraising smile. "They say you are the hardest worker in Eldermere," she mused. "That you never rest, never ask for more than you need. Is it true?" Elias chuckled, shaking his head. "I rest when the work is done, and as for asking for more, well, I have more than enough." Lillian tilted her head slightly. "Most men would not say that," she observed. "Most would take as much as they could carry, and then some." He met her gaze, his expression calm but unwavering. Gold and silver may fill one's pockets, but honesty and kindness fill the soul. And that, I have learned, is worth far more. For a moment, she simply looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to decipher something hidden beneath his simple words. Then, to his surprise, she laughed, a light, melodic sound that sent a shiver down his spine. "You truly are as noble as they say," she said, "perhaps even more so." From that day on, their paths crossed more frequently. Whether by fate or by Lillian's quiet design, she always seemed to be near, lingering by the well when Elias came to draw water, passing by his stall at the market, offering a kind word or a teasing remark whenever they met. Elias, who had spent most of his life alone, felt something stir in him whenever she was near. He had never sought wealth beyond what he needed, nor had he longed for companionship. But Lillian, she was different. She brought light into his world, warmth into his quiet life. She laughed easily, spoke with confidence, and had a way of making even the most ordinary moments feel extraordinary. The villagers, ever watchful, took notice. "They make a fine pair," some would say, watching them from a distance. "A love story fit for the bards," others murmured, nodding in approval. And when, at last, Elias found himself standing before her father, asking for Lillian's hand in marriage, there was little doubt about what her answer would be. Their wedding was a joyous affair, with the entire village gathering to celebrate. Lanterns glowed like stars in the twilight, and laughter filled the air as music and dancing carried on late into the night. Elias, ever the humble man, felt as though he had been given yet another gift he did not deserve. As he looked at Lillian, radiant in the soft glow of candlelight, he silently thanked the old man by the river. Not for gold, not for silver, but for the wisdom that had led him to this moment. Their union brought forth 2 children, a son named Alden and a daughter named Elias, and with them came a joy that Elias had never known before. Alden, the elder of the 2, was a spirited boy with a thirst for adventure. From the moment he could walk, he followed his father into the woods, his small feet stumbling over roots and fallen leaves as he tried to keep up. He would sit wide-eyed, watching Elias swing his axe with precision, listening to the rhythmic crack of wood splitting under the force of each strike. "One day, I'll be strong like you, father," Alden would declare, puffing out his chest with pride. Elias would laugh, ruffling his son's unruly hair. "Strength isn't just in the arms, my boy," he'd say. "It's in the heart, in the choices you make when no one is watching." Elias, on the other hand, was gentle where her brother was bold, thoughtful where he was restless. She spent her days by her mother's side, learning the delicate art of weaving, tending to the garden, and helping to prepare meals for the household. But despite her quiet nature, she had a sharp mind, and an even sharper tongue when provoked. One afternoon, Alden had been boasting about how he would one day become the greatest woodcutter in Eldermere, even better than their father. Elias, never one to be left out, crossed her arms and smirked. "Oh? And what will you do when I become the wisest woman in the village?" she challenged. "You'll need someone to tell you what to do with all that wood you chop, won't you?" Elias had nearly doubled over with laughter at his children's bickering, but more than that, he was proud. They were bright, full of life, and filled his home with a warmth he had never imagined possible. And Lillian, his beautiful, radiant Lillian, seemed to be the heart of it all. Their home, once a simple place of solitude, became a haven of love and laughter. Elias would return from the woods to find the scent of freshly baked bread wafting through the air, his wife humming a tune as she worked. In the evenings they would gather by the hearth, Alden begging for stories of the old days, Elias curled up beside her mother, listening with rapt attention. For a time, Elias believed himself the happiest man alive. He had a thriving business, a loving wife, and 2 children who filled his days with meaning. He had never aspired to great riches, nor had he sought glory, and yet he had been given everything he had ever dared to dream of. But fate, as always, had other plans. It started subtly. Small things that could be brushed off as nothing more than passing shadows. Lillian began to rise earlier than usual, often before dawn, her footsteps soft as she moved about the house. When Elias asked why she was up so early, she would simply smile and say, "There's always so much to do." At first he thought nothing of it. Then came the days when he would return from the woods to find Lillian lost in thought, staring out the window as if searching for something beyond the horizon. When he called her name, she would startle, forcing a smile onto her lips, but Elias could see the flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. And then, there were the absences. She began to leave the house more often, claiming she needed to visit the market, or help a neighbor with a task. She would return with the same smile, the same warmth. But Elias could not shake the feeling that something had changed. One evening, as they lay in bed, he reached for her hand, only to find it cold. "Lillian," he murmured, turning to face her in the dim glow of the firelight. "Is something wrong?" She hesitated, just for a moment. Then, she let out a soft laugh, rolling over to press a kiss to his cheek. "Of course not, my love," she whispered. "Why would anything be wrong?" Elias wanted to believe her. He needed to believe her. But in the deepest part of his heart, a seed of doubt had been planted. It began with whispers, soft, insidious murmurs that slithered through the village like a creeping fog, curling around doorways, slipping beneath windowsills, settling in the ears of those eager to spread them further. At first, Elias ignored them. Gossip was the lifeblood of small villages, a fickle thing that ebbed and flowed, swelling with scandal before dissipating into the mundane. He had lived in Eldermere long enough to know how quickly rumors could twist and distort, how easily a harmless truth could be reshaped into a tale of disgrace. He refused to be swayed by idle chatter, but the whispers did not fade. They clung to him like an unwelcome shadow, growing bolder with each passing day. He could feel them in the wary glances of the townsfolk, hear them in the abrupt pauses when he stepped too close. Conversations would halt, laughter would turn to tight-lipped silence, and eyes, too many eyes, would watch him with something between pity and dread. Still, he silenced his doubts. Lillian was a devoted mother, a skilled homemaker, a loving companion, or so he believed. It wasn't until one evening, when he stopped by the village market later than usual, that the whispers finally reached his ears in a way he could no longer ignore. Two women stood near the baker's stall, their voices hushed but urgent, their heads tilted toward one another in secretive conversation. Elias had not meant to eavesdrop, but his name was the first thing he heard. "Poor Elias. He doesn't deserve this," the other woman sighed. "It's a shame, truly. But are you surprised? Lillian has always had her sights set higher than a simple woodcutter." A chill ran down his spine. His hands tightened around the bundle of flour he had purchased, his knuckles white. He could not move, could not breathe. The words twisted around his chest like a tightening rope. "I heard she was seen by the river again, and not alone." Elias's stomach lurched. He forced himself to step forward, to make his presence known. The women gasped, startled, their faces flushing with guilt. But it was too late. "What did you say?" His voice was steady, but only just. The second woman hesitated, exchanging a glance with her companion. "Elias, we don't mean to upset you, but tell me." A beat of silence passed before the first woman lowered her voice. "She's been meeting someone, a man, by the river." A laugh. A cruel, desperate thing that barely sounded like his own. "That's nonsense." The women exchanged another look. "We only speak of what we've seen." Elias did not remember leaving the market. He did not remember walking home, his mind a storm of denial and fury, of memories both cherished and now poisoned by suspicion. Lillian, laughing as she leaned into his touch. Lillian, singing softly as she tucked their children into bed. Lillian, staring out the window. Lost in thought, by the time he reached the cottage, the sun had dipped below the horizon, bathing the world in twilight. His hands trembled as he pushed open the door. Inside, Lillian stood by the hearth, her golden hair catching the fire's glow, her face serene as she set the table. When she turned to greet him, her smile was warm, welcoming. For the first time, it looked like a lie. Elias swallowed hard, his mouth dry. "Where were you today?" She blinked, tilting her head in confusion. "The market, of course. Why?" His heartbeat thundered in his ears. "And before that?" A pause. Just a brief one, but he saw it. Her lips parted, but no words came. And in that silence, the whispers came roaring back. No longer the faint murmurs of the village, but something undeniable. Something true. Lillian was a devoted mother, a skilled homemaker, a loving companion, or so he had believed. Then came the evening that changed everything. Elias had finished his work early that day, far earlier than expected. The job that was meant to take several days had gone smoother than anticipated. The timber cut, measured, and transported with unexpected efficiency. With no reason to linger, he bid his fellow workers farewell and began the journey home, eager to return to the comforts of his family. The sun was still clinging stubbornly to the horizon when he arrived at the outskirts of the village, casting long golden streaks over the rooftops. He had imagined this homecoming differently. His children's laughter ringing through the air as they chased each other around the yard, Lillian's voice calling them inside for supper. He had pictured her at the hearth, her golden hair tucked behind her ear as she stirred a pot, glancing over her shoulder with a soft smile as he stepped through the door. Instead, an eerie silence settled over the cottage like a suffocating fog. His brow furrowed. Something felt wrong. The usual signs of life were missing. Alden and Elias were not outside playing. No shrill giggles or tiny footsteps pounding against the dirt. The front door, which was often left slightly ajar during the warm evenings, was shut tight. Even the birds in the trees seemed hushed, as if the very air was holding its breath. A cold prickle of unease crept up his spine as he stepped onto the porch, his boots making the wood creak beneath his weight. His grip on the doorknob tightened. It was unlocked. Slowly, cautiously, he pushed it open. The inside of the house was dim, the hearth casting flickering shadows across the walls. The table was set for dinner. But the meal remained unfinished. Half-prepared vegetables on the cutting board, a knife lying carelessly beside them. His heart pounded in his chest. Where was Lillian? Where were the children? A sudden rustling noise from upstairs made him freeze. His breath hitched, and his body went rigid. He had told Lillian he would be gone for several days. She had kissed him goodbye that morning, bidding him safe travels, believing she had time. But he had come home early, and he was about to learn the truth. Frowning, he stepped inside. The air was still, heavy with a tension he could not name. The house felt different. Not in any way he could immediately place. But something was amiss. The scent of bread, usually welcoming, had faded, replaced by the faintest trace of something unfamiliar. Earthy, musky, wrong. His children were gone, likely off playing with the neighbor's kin. He should have been relieved, should have welcomed a rare moment of peace. Instead, unease slithered through him, coiling around his ribs, squeezing tight. Then he heard it. A rustling, soft, nearly imperceptible, from upstairs. Elias stiffened, his breath catching in his throat. His mind scrambled for explanations. A draft, a bird trapped in the eaves, Lillian moving about. But none of them felt right. Something deep in his bones screamed at him. Slowly, carefully, he made his way to the staircase, his boots barely whispering against the wooden floorboards. The house had never felt so vast, the distance to the second floor stretching impossibly long. Each step creaked beneath his weight, a cruel reminder that he was not meant to be here, not at this hour, not now. The closer he drew to the bedroom, the louder the rustling became, shifting, shuffling, followed by something else. A hushed laugh, low and breathless. His breath left him in a sharp exhale, his vision narrowing. The door to his chamber stood slightly ajar, candlelight flickering through the gap. The scent that had lingered in the air was stronger now, unmistakable, laced with something intimate, something that did not belong to him. His hands clenched into fists. He did not want to look. He did not want to know. But the human heart is a cruel thing. With the weight of inevitability pressing down upon him, Elias reached out and pushed the door open. And in that instant, his world shattered. There, tangled in the sheets of their marital bed, was Lillian, his beloved wife, wrapped in the arms of another man. The sight struck Elias like a hammer to the chest. For a moment, his mind refused to process it, as if shielding him from a reality too cruel to bear. The air left his lungs in a strangled gasp, and his knees nearly buckled beneath him, his vision blurred at the edges, the candlelight casting cruel, flickering shadows across the room, illuminating the betrayal in vivid detail. The man, Elias knew him, recognized the sharp features, the smug smirk that had always lingered at the edge of his lips. A traveling merchant, a man of wealth, of smooth words and empty promises. He had visited the village many times, his wares tempting those who longed for more than their modest lives could offer. He was here, standing half naked in Elias's home, in Elias's bed, with Elias's wife. The merchant sprang from the bed in a frantic scramble, his limbs tangling in the sheets as he groped for his discarded clothes. He nearly tripped in his haste, cursing under his breath as he fumbled to pull on his breeches. But Elias barely saw him. His gaze was fixed on Lillian. She did not flinch. She did not scramble to cover herself or stammer out excuses. She simply sat up, the silk sheets pooling at her waist, her golden hair tumbling over bare shoulders, her expression eerily composed. For a fleeting moment, Elias searched her face, desperate to find some flicker of remorse, some trace of the woman he had once known. But there was nothing. No shame, no regret, only quiet finality. The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating. Then, she spoke. "You were never enough, Elias." Her voice was calm, almost gentle, but each word sliced into him like a freshly whetted blade. Elias recoiled as if struck, his breath hitching in his throat, his heart, already splintering, cracked further under the weight of her words. "You live like a simpleton," she continued, her gaze unwavering, "clinging to your old ways, working the land like a mule, year after year scraping by, expecting me to be satisfied with this." She gestured around the room, their room, as if it were nothing more than a cage. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "I deserve more." The finality in her tone was devastating. Elias opened his mouth, but no words came. What was there to say? His wife, his love, his partner, had already weighed his worth and found him lacking. His devotion, his labor, his very being. None of it had been enough for her. The walls of the room seemed to close in around him, suffocating, drowning him in the unbearable truth. She had made her choice. And it wasn't him. The night was unnaturally still, thick with an eerie silence that pressed against the walls of Elias's home. A single candle flickered on the crude wooden table, its feeble glow barely pushing back the shadows that crept in from every corner. Elias sat unmoving, his hands slack in his lap, his head bowed as though the weight of his own thoughts was too much to bear. The evening had unraveled him. He had come home early, expecting warmth, laughter, his children's voices carrying through the air, the scent of supper filling the home. Instead, he had returned to emptiness, to betrayal. The image of Lillian in another man's arms was burned into his mind, searing deeper with every passing second. The numbness that had taken hold of him was a mercy, shielding him from the full force of his pain. He did not notice the soft creak of the floorboards. Lillian moved through the house with a practiced ease, her every action precise and deliberate. She had not been caught off guard by Elias's return, only inconvenienced. She had expected more time, had planned for days, perhaps weeks, to execute her departure with care. She moved swiftly, efficiently, because the opportunity had come sooner than she had hoped. There was no hesitation in her hands as she unlatched trunks, pulled garments from their resting places, and emptied drawers of their contents. The few trinkets Elias had saved from his parents disappeared into the depths of her satchel. She took everything of value. Coins tucked away for the hard winters, jewelry gifted in better days, even the fine linens she had once praised as too precious for everyday use. But it was not enough. At the back of the storage chest, hidden beneath layers of neatly folded cloth, gleamed the silver and gold axes, the very symbols of Elias's virtue. The reward for his honesty, the tools that had elevated him from a poor woodcutter to a man of means. Lillian's breath hitched as her fingers curled around the hilts. They were heavier than she expected. Their metal cool beneath her touch. These were not just possessions. They were a testament to his goodness, his unwavering belief in right and wrong. And she would take them without a second thought. At the doorway, her lover waited, the dim candlelight casting his face in harsh relief. A merchant by trade, he was a man who thrived on opportunity. He had courted Lillian not with love, but with promises, of wealth, of adventure, of a life beyond the small, simple village of Eldermere. The dagger rested at his belt, its hilt worn from use. Whether it was for protection or something more sinister, he did not say, and Lillian did not ask. When the last of Elias's fortune had been gathered, she rose to her full height and took one final glance around the room. Her gaze landed on him. Her husband, the man who had given her everything. He had not moved. He was still sitting at the table, staring into the void, lost in his own sorrow. The candle's flame trembled, casting restless shadows across his face. For the briefest moment, something flickered in her expression. Not guilt, not regret, something closer to relief. Then, she turned away and stepped silently into the night. Outside, the world was draped in darkness. The grass was damp beneath her feet, the crisp night air carrying the scent of pine and earth. She moved quickly, her breath steady, her heart thrumming not with fear but with exhilaration. The merchant's horse stood waiting at the edge of the woods, its breath misting in the cold air. The saddlebags sagged under the weight of her spoils, of Elias's labor, his trust, his love, all reduced to stolen coin and precious metal. The merchant mounted first, then reached down, offering his hand. Lillian hesitated for only a moment before gripping it and swinging herself up behind him. As soon as she settled, a slow smile spread across her lips. She threw her head back, laughter slipping past her lips. A light, breathless sound that melted into the whispering wind. Then, with a sharp kick, the horse surged forward. The village of Eldermere shrank behind them, its cottages swallowed by the vast, unyielding darkness. Elias awoke to an unbearable silence. The house, his home, was empty. For a moment, his mind struggled to make sense of it, clinging to the fragile hope that it was all a nightmare. But the truth stood before him, undeniable. The open chest, the missing coin, the absent warmth of his wife and children, the silver and gold axes, stolen. His hands trembled as he rose to his feet. His heart beat a dull thud in his ears. He turned toward the door, half expecting Lillian to be there, waiting, laughing, telling him it was all some cruel joke. But there was nothing, only the cold morning air seeping through the cracks in the walls. She was gone. And all that remained was the hollow ache in his chest, an emptiness so vast it felt as if it might consume him whole. With Lillian gone, Elias was left standing in the ruins of the life he had built, a house stripped of warmth, a heart emptied of certainty. The silence that followed her departure was heavier than the howling winds of winter, heavier than the burdens he had carried as a simple woodcutter before fortune had smiled upon him. His children, Alden and Elise, were too young to grasp the depth of their mother's betrayal. They did not understand why she was gone, why the space where her presence once lingered now felt like a hollow wound carved into their home. Elise, still just a little girl, would wake in the night crying for her mother, her small hands clutching the blanket Elias had wrapped around her, as if holding it tightly enough would bring back the warmth she longed for. Alden, though older, tried to be brave, but in the quiet moments, when he thought no one was looking, Elias caught glimpses of the pain in his son's eyes, the hurt of abandonment, the confusion of a child who had been forced to grow up too soon. Elias tried to be strong for them, but inside, he was unraveling. Lillian had not just taken his wealth, she had stolen his very foundation. The home he had built with years of labor now felt foreign, stripped of the laughter that had once filled its halls. Every object left behind was a cruel reminder of what had been lost. The hearth, where she once cooked their meals, now stood cold and unused. The wooden chair where she would sit and mend their clothes was empty, untouched. The scent of her perfume still clung to the fabric of their bed, a phantom of her presence that mocked him with every breath. But worst of all was the absence of his silver and gold axes. Those had been more than mere tools. They had been proof of his honesty, his virtue, his belief that goodness was rewarded in the end. They had allowed him to prosper, to rise above the poverty that had once defined his life. And now they were gone, taken by the very woman he had once trusted with his heart. Without them, he was no longer a man of means. The days that followed were harsh and unrelenting. The villagers who had once admired him with whispers of praise now watched him with wary eyes, some with pity, others with quiet judgment. People loved a tale of fortune, but they reveled in tragedy just as easily. Where once they had called him blessed, now they murmured about how quickly the mighty could fall. With no other choice, Elias returned to the one skill that had sustained him in his youth: woodcutting. Gone were the days of prosperity, of abundance, of knowing that his labor would bring more than enough to provide for his children. Now he was reduced to the same life he had known before fortune had smiled upon him. A life of toil, of sweat, of aching muscles and weary bones. But this time, he carried not only the weight of the wood upon his back, but the crushing burden of loss. Each morning, long before the sun spilled its golden light over the valley, Elias would rise in darkness, the cold air biting at his skin as he pulled on his worn boots and took up his axe. No longer the silver or gold tools gifted to him by the old man, but a simple iron one, the same axe his father had left him, now dull with age, its handle rough from years of use. He would set out into the forest while his children still slept, the house quiet in his absence. The towering trees greeted him like old friends, their branches whispering in the early morning wind. But there was no comfort in the woods now, only the ceaseless demand of survival. The work was brutal. He cut and gathered wood for hours on end, the weight of each log pressing into his shoulders as he carried heavy bundles back to the village. His hands, once calloused from years of labor but softened during his years of prosperity, grew rough once more. His palms split open, bleeding from the strain, but he did not stop. His muscles burned, his back ached, but he gritted his teeth and swung his axe again and again. He had no time for self-pity. He could not afford to crumble beneath the weight of his grief. His children, Alden and Elias, needed him. They did not care that their mother had stolen their fortune, that Elias had once known a life of comfort before it was ripped away. They cared only that their father was still here, that he still carried them on his shoulders, still whispered stories to them at night, still made sure there was food on the table, even if it was only a meager meal of bread and broth. And so, day after day, he labored. When the sun was high in the sky, he hauled his bundles of wood into the village, selling them for mere scraps of coin, enough to buy food, but never enough to rebuild what had been lost. At night, he would return home exhausted, his body screaming for rest. But rest was a luxury he could no longer afford. He had once been a man of means. Now, he was a man barely scraping by. But he endured. And still, fate was merciless. The afternoon sun burned low in the sky, its amber glow filtering through the towering trees, casting long, restless shadows across the forest floor. The air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine, mingling with the sweat clinging to Elias's skin. His breaths came slow and steady, each one measured against the burden strapped to his back. A bundle of freshly cut logs, bound tight with rope, pressing into his aching shoulders. The weight was familiar, the pain expected. This was his life now. His hands, once calloused by wealth, had returned to their former state. Rough, blistered, lined with the evidence of hard labor. But he endured. He always endured. The deeper he ventured into the woods, the more treacherous the path became. Ancient roots jutted from the ground like gnarled fingers, half hidden beneath a blanket of fallen leaves. He had traveled this way before, but exhaustion dulled his senses, turned sharp eyes sluggish, made careful steps reckless. Then it happened. His foot caught on something unseen, a thick, twisted root lurking just beneath the surface. The world shifted. The weight on his back pulled him down like an anchor, yanking him forward before he could so much as gasp. His arms flailed instinctively, grasping for something. Anything, to stop the fall. There was nothing. His body crashed against the earth, the impact stealing the air from his lungs. But the true agony came a second later, a sharp, sickening crack. White-hot pain exploded through his leg, so sudden and violent that the world seemed to blur at the edges. He couldn't even scream. The breath to do so had been stolen by the sheer force of his suffering. He lay there, chest heaving, eyes wide, as a fresh wave of pain tore through him. For a moment, he couldn't comprehend it. His mind refused to accept what his body already knew. Then he looked down. His leg. His strong, unbreakable leg was twisted at an unnatural angle. The breath he had fought for escaped in a ragged, choked sound. No. This couldn't be happening. His fingers dug into the dirt, knuckles white, veins standing out against the strain. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing the pain to be a lie, a trick of the mind. But when he shifted, just barely, a fresh lance of agony shot up his spine, sharp enough to rip a cry from his throat. He was alone. The realization hit him harder than the fall itself. No one had seen him leave that morning. No one knew how far he had gone. The village was miles away, beyond hills, past rivers, beyond the reach of even the strongest voice. Night would fall soon, and with it, the cold. His body trembled. Panic clawed at the edges of his thoughts. A slow, creeping terror that threatened to consume reason. He forced himself to breathe through the pain, to push past the fear rising in his chest. Alden, Elias, their faces flashed in his mind, their laughter, their tiny hands reaching for him, their voices calling for their father. He could not, would not, die here. With a grunt of effort, he dug his elbows into the ground, dragging himself forward an inch. Pain flared like fire through his leg, but he bit down on his lower lip, refusing to cry out. He would move. He would crawl if he had to, because beyond the agony, beyond the terror, beyond the crushing weight of misfortune that had plagued him time and time again, his children were waiting for him. The pain in Elias's leg was unbearable, a fire licking up his spine with every shallow breath he took. His body trembled with the weight of his suffering, but worse than the physical agony was the crushing weight of despair pressing against his chest. He had fought for so long, endured so much, and now, after all these years of hardship, of clawing his way back from ruin, fate had struck him down once more. His vision blurred, not just from pain but from the raw sorrow swelling inside him. Alone in the vastness of the forest, with night creeping ever closer, he felt smaller than he ever had before. A broken man, abandoned by fortune, left to wither beneath the towering trees. Then, through the heavy silence, a voice, soft yet powerful, carrying the weight of time itself, cut through the dusk. "Why do you weep, child?" Elias's breath caught in his throat. That voice. It was impossible. Slowly, he lifted his head, his vision still swimming, unsure whether the pain had conjured some cruel illusion. But when his gaze finally steadied, his heart lurched in his chest. There, standing before him, bathed in the last golden light of the dying sun, was him, the old man from the river. Elias had not seen him in years. So many years that he had begun to believe the encounter itself had been a dream, a story woven by memory into something too miraculous to be real. And yet, here he was, as unchanged as if time had never dared to touch him. His emerald robes were as flawless as they had been on that fateful day by the riverbank, shimmering with an almost ethereal glow. His long, silver-white beard cascaded over his chest, untouched by age or weariness. And his eyes, those wise, knowing eyes, glistened with a light deeper than mere sight, as though they saw not only Elias's pain, but the very threads of his fate. Elias could not speak. His lips parted, but no sound came forth. How could this be? Why had he appeared now, of all times? The old man did not repeat his question. He did not need to. His gaze alone beckoned Elias to unburden his soul. And so, with his strength failing and his heart raw, Elias poured everything out. His voice trembled as he spoke of the life he had built after their first meeting, of the love he had found, the family he had cherished. He told him of Lillian, the woman he had trusted above all else, of how she had shattered their vows, stolen his fortune, and left him to raise their children alone. He spoke of the long, back-breaking years that followed, of the endless labor, the sleepless nights, the sacrifices he had made just to keep going. And finally, he told him of this moment, of the accident that had left him broken and alone in the heart of the wilderness, helpless against the night and the dangers it would bring. When at last the words ran dry, silence settled between them like a thick, unmoving fog. The wind whispered through the trees, rustling the leaves overhead. But the old man said nothing. His expression did not shift, not with sorrow, nor pity, nor judgment. He only watched, and in that watchful stillness, Elias felt something stir deep within his chest, something he had not dared to feel in a long, long time. Hope, or a long moment. The old man simply stood there, his gaze steady, unreadable. Then he smiled. It was not a mere expression, not just the simple upward curve of lips. It was something deeper, a quiet knowing, a certainty beyond mortal understanding, the kind of smile that carried the weight of unseen truths, of things yet to unfold, a smile that sent a strange shiver through Elias's weary soul. Then, in a voice as soft as the wind through the trees, the old man spoke. "There is a woman," he murmured, as if sharing a secret meant only for Elias's ears. "One who has loved you from afar for many years." Elias blinked, his breath hitching. "A woman?" But before he could ask, the old man continued, his tone calm, certain. "She never knew of your family, only of your kindness. She has waited, longing for you, unaware of the trials you have faced." Elias's pulse quickened, confusion and disbelief warring within him. His mind scrambled to grasp the meaning of these words, to unravel the mystery of this unseen heart that had carried affection for him without his knowledge. Who was she? Who was this woman who had watched him from the shadows of time, whose heart had held a silent love while he had lived in ignorance of it? His lips parted, his voice rough with exhaustion and uncertainty. "Who is she?" The old man's smile deepened, but he did not answer. Instead, a breeze stirred through the trees, ruffling his emerald robes. The light in his eyes gleamed with something unreadable, something vast. He tilted his head ever so slightly, as if listening to something beyond Elias's understanding, some silent whisper in the fabric of the world. "You will see soon enough," he said at last. The words were simple, yet they carried an undeniable finality, an unshakable promise. Before Elias could speak again, before he could demand answers, reach for understanding, the old man was gone, vanished. No flash of light, no rustle of movement, no sign that he had ever been there at all. He stood beneath the towering trees, and the next, emptiness. The forest swallowed the silence, the leaves whispering in the fading light. The only proof that he had not imagined it all was the lingering warmth in the air, the faint echo of a voice that seemed to hum in the wind. Elias sat there, breathless, heart pounding. Somewhere, beyond the veil of his grief and hardship, fate was shifting. Elias awoke to a world bathed in golden morning light, the hush of the forest wrapping around him like a gentle whisper. For a moment he remained still, caught between the remnants of pain and the strange, unsettling absence of it. He should have been in agony. He should have been struggling to move, the break in his leg rendering him helpless for weeks, maybe months. Yet, as he flexed his foot, then pressed his hands over the place where the injury had been, he felt nothing. No swelling, no bruising, not even the dull ache of healing bones. It was as though it had never happened. A shiver ran down his spine. Then, the old man's voice echoed in his mind. "There is a woman who has loved you from afar for many years. She never knew of your family, only of your kindness. She has waited, longing for you, unaware of the trials you have faced." Elias let out a slow breath, his chest tightening. He had not thought of love in years, not since Lillian's betrayal had crushed the very notion of it from his heart. But now, for the first time in a long while, a flicker of something unfamiliar stirred within him. Hope. Somewhere beyond this moment, she was waiting. He did not have to wait long. It was market day, the village bustling with life. The scent of fresh bread and ripe fruit filled the air as merchants called out their wares, coins clinking in steady rhythm. Elias had just finished selling a bundle of firewood when something, or rather, someone, caught his eye. A woman stood a few feet away, the sunlight catching in her dark brown hair, turning it to rich chestnut. She was neither adorned in fine silks nor wrapped in gold like Lillian had once been. Yet there was an undeniable elegance about her, a quiet grace that needed no embellishment. She held a woven basket in the crook of her arm, her fingers brushing absently over the fresh herbs inside. But what struck Elias most was her eyes. A deep, knowing hazel, warm as autumn, and filled with something he could not name. Recognition stirred in the back of his mind. He had seen her before, though never like this. Mira. She was the village healer, a woman known for her gentle spirit and steady hands. She lived on the outskirts of town, tending to an herb garden that had saved countless lives. She was kindness and patience, woven into human form. And yet, she was a stranger to him. She does not know about my family. The old man's words rang in his ears, and suddenly, he understood. She had admired him from a distance, never knowing of the life he had lost, the wife who had betrayed him, the children he had fought so hard to protect. She had only seen the man who worked tirelessly, the man who helped others despite his burdens. She had loved that man. Mira hesitated before taking a step forward, as if gathering her courage. "Elias?" she said, her voice soft yet steady. He turned to her fully, surprised to hear his name from her lips. "You know me?" he asked. A shy smile curved her lips. "Everyone in the village knows you." Her fingers tightened around the handle of her basket. "You bring us firewood in the winter. You help mend fences when storms roll through. You carry heavy loads for those who cannot. You have always been." She paused, her eyes searching his. "Kind." Elias blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of her words. For so long, he had been seen as the man who was left behind, the man who had been robbed of everything. That was what he had become, a shadow of someone who had once dreamed, once hoped. But Mira did not see the broken parts of him. She saw only kindness. Something cracked open in his chest, something buried for too long beneath the weight of sorrow. He did not speak, not at first. Instead, he studied her, searching for deception, for pity. He found none. There was no agenda in her gaze, no hidden intentions, only quiet admiration. The flicker of warmth inside him grew stronger. It was not love, not yet, but it was something, a spark in the darkness, a glimmer of possibility where once there had been none. And as Mira offered him a soft, knowing smile, Elias realized he was ready to take the first step towards something new. Elias and Mira's love did not bloom in haste, nor did it come wrapped in grand gestures or fiery passion. It was steady, unshakable, built not on fleeting infatuation but on trust, mutual respect, and a quiet understanding that words alone could never express. They married in the heart of spring, when the valley was alive with color, and the river sang a melody of renewal. The village gathered to celebrate, the elders whispering blessings, the children weaving garlands of wildflowers. It was not a lavish ceremony. There were no extravagant gowns, no halls filled with gold. But when Elias looked into Mira's eyes and saw the unwavering faith she had in him, he knew that he had found something far greater than riches. He had found home. Their life together was not easy. They had no fortune to fall back on, no fine estate to call their own. But they had each other, and that alone made the burdens lighter. Elias returned to his trade, not just as a woodcutter, but as a man determined to reclaim what had been stolen from him. Day after day he ventured into the forest, his iron axe biting into the trunks of ancient trees. His hands, once rough from years of hardship, grew calloused again, but he took pride in the ache. Every swing of the axe, every bundle of wood he carried to the village, was a step toward rebuilding. Mira, too, worked tirelessly. When she was not tending to the sick, she labored beside him, her hands in the soil, coaxing life from the earth. She planted herbs and crops, raised chickens for eggs, and gathered honey from the hives near their home. She wove baskets in the evenings, selling them in the market alongside Elias's firewood. They did not grow wealthy overnight, but little by little, they rebuilt. The home Elias had lost, the one that had once been hollowed out by betrayal, was now filled with warmth, with laughter, with the scent of fresh bread and herbs drying by the fire. The ache in his heart, the emptiness Lillian had left behind, faded with each passing season. Mira had given him a new beginning. As the years passed, their efforts bore fruit. The land they worked became prosperous, their small farm flourished, the fields yielding more than enough to feed their growing family. Cattle grazed upon rolling pastures, hens clucked in the yard, and the orchard they planted together bore sweet apples in the autumn. They had not only reclaimed what had been stolen from Elias, but had built something even greater. And at the heart of it all was love. Not the fleeting love Elias had once mistaken for devotion, but a love that endured, a love that whispered in the quiet moments, in the way Mira took his calloused hands in hers after a long day, in the way she prepared his favorite meal without being asked, in the way she stood beside him, always, no matter the hardship. For the first time in his life, Elias was whole. As the years stretched onward, Alden and Elise, his children from his first marriage, grew strong and wise, molded by the hardships their father had endured. Alden became a man of great integrity. Carrying his father's lessons in his heart, he worked beside Elias, learning not just the trade but the value of hard work, of perseverance, of honor. Elise, with her mother's gentleness but her father's resolve, followed in Mira's footsteps, becoming a healer in her own right. And in time, Elias and Mira were blessed with a child of their own, a son they named Tobias. As the boy grew, it became clear that he carried within him a keen mind and a boundless curiosity, always questioning, always learning. While his older siblings worked the land and carried on their father's trade, Tobias sought knowledge, his sharp wit and thoughtful nature setting him apart. They did not grow bitter from their past. Instead, they flourished, guided by Elias's unwavering belief that even in the face of betrayal, even when all seems lost, life can begin anew. And so, Elias lived, not just as the man who had been betrayed, not just as the woodcutter who had lost everything, but as the man who had risen from the ashes, stronger, wiser, and infinitely richer in the things that truly mattered. And when he looked upon the home he had built, the family he had cherished, and the woman who had stood beside him through it all, he knew. He had gained far more than he had ever lost. Far from the quiet valley where she had once lived, Lillian's fate tumbled into darkness, unraveling with the same speed and ruthlessness as the greed that had driven her. She had stolen everything: Elias's wealth, his hard-earned fortune, even the silver and gold axes that once symbolized his honesty. With her lover by her side, she vanished into the world beyond the village, seeking a life of luxury, believing she had outsmarted fate itself. For a time, it seemed she had. With the stolen wealth, she lived as she had always dreamed, wrapped in silk, dining on the finest meals, basking in the thrill of wealth she had never toiled for. The stolen axes, symbols of Elias's virtue, were sold off for a small fortune, funding extravagant feasts and endless indulgences. But gold gained through treachery never lingers for long. What began as abundance soon crumbled into desperation. The riches she had stolen, once seemingly endless, bled away like water slipping through cupped hands. Her lover, who had promised her the world, was reckless, spending without care, gambling away what little they had left. The life of ease they had imagined turned into something far more desperate. Debts piled up, once welcoming doors shut in their faces, and their fine clothes became worn and tattered. There were no friends to turn to, no allies to call upon. The world had no patience for those who had taken but never given. Then, when the last of their gold was gone, her lover did what she had once done to Elias. He left. Without a word. Without remorse. She woke one morning to find herself truly alone, abandoned in a place where no one knew her name, where no one cared if she lived or died. Lillian, once the envy of the village, became just another forgotten soul, lost in the streets of a foreign town. She begged for food but received only scorn. She searched for work, but found only closed doors. The beauty that had once been her greatest weapon had faded, replaced by hollow cheeks and lifeless eyes. hunger became her constant companion. Illness followed soon after, and so, in the cold shadows of an alley, with no warm embrace, no kind words, and no one left to even remember her name, Lillian's story came to an end. But Elias never looked back. He did not curse her name. He did not dwell on revenge. He did not waste even a breath wondering where she had gone. His victory was not in her ruin. It was in the life he built from the ashes. The lesson was clear. True wealth was never in silver and gold. It was in love, in family, in the quiet, unshakable peace of a heart that had endured, a soul that had suffered but refused to break. And so, as Elias stood upon his land, watching the golden sun sink beneath the horizon, he knew the truth at last. The greatest treasures in life are the ones we build with our own hands, the ones we hold in our hearts,